Hello and welcome to the Fit4Privacy Podcast, the podcast for those who care about privacy. I'm your host Punit, and here we have conversations with industry leaders about their perspectives, ideas and opinions relating to privacy and data protection matters. Before we start, a quick disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed are not legal advice. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Fit4Privacy Podcast, and today we have a guest who is passionate about evolution of technology, how we search, whom we trust, what keeps our information safe and private, and how reputation works in digital world. He believes in protecting privacy, battling disinformation, promoting positive conversations, positive online conversations, and he has four interests: data privacy, cognitive computing, content development, and trust systems. He's the founder and CEO of PrivacyPlan, and I'm talking about Jeff Jockisch. So welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Punit. Appreciate it. Wonderful to be here today.
Thanks so much for your time. And let's start with your story. So how did you get into the field of data privacy?
Well, it's actually been a long journey. I've been in the technology space. I've actually been a serial entrepreneur for quite a long time, mostly in the internet space. Probably the largest role that I've had prior to getting into privacy was as a content expert for Cha-Cha, which was a search engine, an SMS-based search engine, where we answered 4 billion questions, primarily for teens and young adults.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, we sort of ended up about 6 years ago, but it was a long-running startup for about 8 years. So just as search engine technology was developing and Google was getting its legs under it, we were, also developing this sort of text-based search engine. And it was really a fun thing. And so I got to sort of understand how you develop a search engine, how you moderate content, and a lot of those types of things. Also had to deal with some regulations, CAN spam, and a variety of other things. Not really in the same way we deal with privacy now, because privacy wasn't nearly as big of an issue, back then. But we did have to, understand what COPA was, and start to understand what privacy meant in our digital world.
That's interesting. So from marketing, search engine to privacy, that's an interesting journey.
Yes, yeah. It was only about a little over 4 years ago that I actually got into privacy. I started working for a company that is a privacy consultancy, and actually doing that job as a director of marketing for them, and realized at that point how big privacy was going to be. This was as Europe was debating the GDPR, before they'd actually passed it. And I could just sort of see in the horizon what was coming. At that point, I was really focused a lot on viral content, coming to that job from a viral marketing agency in Delray Beach, and just saying, wow, I think this is where I want to go next. And did a little bit of moving around here and there after that. And then I started PrivacyPlan. And I've sort of directed that company that I'm at now to focusing on data sets for the privacy world. And I guess that's sort of how we met, right?
Yeah, that's how we met. And you maintain a large amount of data sets, or from what I understand, data set about the podcast, privacy podcast that exists, data set about the books on privacy, and what else do you maintain in terms of data sets, if I may ask?
Sure. Actually, a lot of stuff that people don't know about yet because I haven't really released it. But I've also got a large data set on data brokers that we could talk about a little bit. But I'm also doing a lot of data on privacy regulations. Of course, many people do that. But I'm also doing stuff that I think are going to be some pretty great training tools for people looking for certification, and also just reference tools. In fact, what I'm really been sort of developing that I haven't told too many people about is that I'm trying to create sort of a training and reference set of information that I'm either going to launch on my website or someone else's. And I sort of expect that that's probably going to generate a lot of clicks for myself or someone. Maybe in the order of 100,000 uniques a month once I put all that data out there. Because I think it's pretty interesting, unique, and significant.
Yep. And when you say the training data brokers, what do you mean by a data broker? Because I also saw one of your posts on LinkedIn about data brokers, but not everyone understands data broker. And coming from you, I think that'll be the simplest definition of it. Of course, we can always debate, but what is a data broker and how do people use a data broker?
So, the definition of a data broker is, well, it's simple in its most basic form, right? I mean, a data broker is somebody that aggregates and then shares or sells data, right? That's what the Wikipedia definition is.
Yeah.
But when you start to put that into legislation, it gets more complicated because lots of companies don't want to be defined as a data broker. And so if you look at the legislation in California and Vermont, for instance, the definition of a data broker is only people that sell data. It doesn't include people that share data, right? So you've got to actually physically transact with money. I think that the CPRA may change that definition. It certainly changes the definition of how that transaction works in the law. I'm not sure how that affects the definition of whether those brokers have to register. I actually need to look that up. I'm not sure how that affects the data broker registration law in California. But obviously, a lot of people that are just sharing information aren't registering under the California law at this point in time. So it's complicated, right?
It is.
I've actually put together a taxonomy. Taxonomy is really the wrong word, right? A classification system for data brokers, where I've got sort of 4 different buckets that I put brokers into: people searches, people search engines, right? Risk mitigation companies, data targeters, and then data monetizers, right? And data monetizers are really large online service providers like social media companies, people that are aggregating large amounts of data and then not necessarily selling it directly, but sharing it with other companies or allowing them to do targeting based on that.
So essentially, data broker is somebody who provides aggregated data, but it's not personal data. It's not something with which a person whose data has been aggregated gets impacted.
Right.
Good, because that's a concern sometimes people have, and we need to make sure, and I wanted to make sure that we address that a data broker is not a personal data broker. We are not taking people's data and selling their email ID, name, and so on. That's not what we are talking about.
Right. It's not necessarily directly their personal data, but it's information that could be used to target them, right?
Right. It's insights, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, a lot of that de-identified data can be re-identified often, which is really the problem. Because, I think the biggest problem that we have is not that any individual data broker is being necessarily a bad actor. But the problem is that because all of this this information about us gets shared and copied and shared and sometimes stolen or leaked or, just hemorrhaged from one company to another, that we've got probably 10 or 20,000 companies out there that have full profiles, or large profiles on all of us, right?
True.
Because they can grab a little bit of data here and a little bit of data there, and they grab some unique identifier, and then they just aggregate that stuff, right? Because they get a little bit of it from this company, a little bit here, grab a little bit of this, buy some over there, and all of a sudden, every company that you can think of has a profile on each of us.
Yeah.
And that's a scary proposition.
That is scary indeed, because that profiling that they do, actually, I heard and I believe it as well, that, some of the social media companies, without naming anyone, know more about us than our partners or spouses if we have liked or clicked about 100 times over there.
Yeah, and that's just for 100 clicks.
Indeed, and 100 clicks and our profile and aggregation, and they can know about us better than our partners, which is amazing.
Well, I mean, we worry about, the specific personally identifying information, right? But it's those insights that they can get from the 100 clicks, right? Or, in the case of Cambridge Analytica, right, being able to just do some psychometric analysis on a couple of different data points, figuring out how neurotic we are, or how, this particular, how we rate on a particular scale, lets them target ads at us that can influence our behavior.
Yeah.
That's very powerful.
It is very powerful. Last week, I was talking to somebody and we were to help him. I was coaching him and we were to help him profile himself. Basically, what are his values and how does he behave and act? And I was looking for a value assessment for him. I know of some which are paid, but they are expensive. And then I came across one which was quick. Just choose 5 or 10 words, I don't remember exactly, amongst a set of words. So I tried it just to guide him first on myself. And after those 10 words, they ask you your name and email and they send you your profile. And I would say from those 5 or 7 clicks or 10 clicks, they could send me a profile which was very close to who I am. So 10 clicks and they know who I am, and they could write a report of 2 pages about me, a value assessment, which is very, very, very powerful. I didn't believe it. I said, how can somebody do my value assessment with 5 or 7 or 10 clicks? But they could. And the cost of that free assessment was my name and email.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's how it works. So how would you describe GDPR in one word? Because you said you were fascinated by privacy and when you were in marketing field, and that was your motivations. How would you describe GDPR in one word?
Foundational.
Foundational. That's interesting. And what's the motivation behind it? That one word.
So there's been a lot of legislation in the past that really, GDPR built on, right? So there was very little that was actually new, but it's sort of an edifice that everybody's building upon now because it was so important.
Yeah.
But there's actually another word that I would probably throw out there if you wanted to take the most impact from that legislation, right? Other than foundational, right? And that is 4%. Because without that word, right, foundational wouldn't have meant anything.
No, I think that's the one which makes people talk about it.
Right. Because that's the one that made all the CEOs and the people running these companies set up. Without the 4%, without those fines, we wouldn't be sitting here talking. The world would be a different place. Now, maybe we would eventually get here, but it wouldn't have happened in the same way or in the same time frame.
Yeah. No, I can share that. It happened to me personally also. I was working with the COO and We were looking into the Belgian legislation, the past legislation based on the Data Protection Act of 95 or Directive of 95, and the fine was 600,000, and the cost of implementation was 3 or 4 million. So okay, we'll take 600,000 in function of 3 million. But when the GDPR came in, the cost or the risk of fine was about 140, 130 million. So essentially, the conversation changed. It was not a question of 2 million, 3 million, or 4 million. It was a question of we have to do it just because of that 4%. Indeed.
Yes. I believe it's not just the number, right? It's the PR impact of thinking, how am I going to explain that to my board or the public if I get hit with that fine, right? So it is the money, but it's also the impact of the money, right?
Yeah.
Of having to explain the money.
Indeed. And it's not just 4%. 4% is the fine which can happen, or maybe 4% would not be. It maybe will be 0.1, 0.2%. But it's the brand damage, it's the reputational damage, it's the operational consequences because you have to get a PR exercise to overcome it. We then have operational losses as well because in that time, rather than focusing on business, you're focused on these things. And then the customer impact, the customer trust issues and all that comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are living in a world of data, or the world in which there's overload of information, overload of connections, overload of posts. I mean, even on LinkedIn, I sometimes struggle to follow things which I want to follow because there's so many of those. So you have to make it time bound. So how do you see this information fatigue and how does it impact privacy, especially when you are managing or creating these data sets? What do you observe in terms of impact on privacy?
I think that that decision fatigue affects each of us every day.
Right.
When we download apps and accept a EULA without reading it, when we visit a website and say allow all cookies because we can't be bothered to read it and think about it, when we make a crappy password for our new account because we haven't installed the password manager.
Yeah.
When we use the same tools and websites that we know are tracking us and abusing our data, but we just don't have the energy to find an alternative to Google or Facebook or Amazon, right?
Yeah.
Fred Kate, who's a privacy researcher from Indiana University, he wrote a paper that I really like called Notice and Consent in the World of Big Data back in 2013 that is really good. He's actually written a lot of stuff that I like that really sort of talks about that, right? Now, 7 years ago. Of course, I didn't read it in 2013. I just read it a while ago, but also even the FTC back 10 years ago was talking about this stuff, saying that notice and consent was inadequate to protect consumers.
Right.
And I think we have to come to grips with that there are so many companies throwing so much at us that just telling us that they're taking our information and saying, yeah, do you want to opt in? That doesn't work anymore because we don't have time to even evaluate that equation.
Indeed, and I think it's challenging. If it's challenging for us as privacy professionals, how much of challenge a normal person not understanding and knowing about privacy would have. That's what is amazing and fascinating because the real problem is there, not with us, because we still understand, and with that we can detect or we can observe if it's suspicious website or not. But a normal layman just browsing internet, he or she may not have or will not have those skills to have even that judgment. Forget about reading the privacy notice or cookie statement.
Yeah, I agree. if you look at data subject access requests, I think some of the same logic applies. I love the fact that the GDPR and the CCPA gives people the right to request their information, the right to modify, the right to delete. But when you have, so many data brokers and data holders out there, who has the time to contact all of them and go through their individual, request processes to be able to do that?
Yeah, that's
hundreds or thousands of times.
Yeah, that's one part. And another part is, even when you request, then they ask for more information, because some of the companies, their approach is more other way around. Prove me that I have your data. Send me your ID card, and so they're asking more data, and it's counterproductive. And unless you have really an intention to drag them into a inquiry or a complaint, it doesn't work, or you have a solid case.
Right. I think that'll get better, but it's not working particularly well right now. I think the Attorney General of California knows that. Consumer Reports just did a piece on it saying that the process is not working particularly well. I've got a friend, a privacy researcher out in California, Craig Erickson, who's been doing a lot of research on DSARs. That's pretty interesting, his work. And, there's also some companies that are trying to offer some third-party tools to help, right? But they're not quite there yet. And because of the identity resolution issues, that's a little problematic still as well, right? I think we'll get there, but it's just not working at the moment.
I think it's a journey we are on, and we are in the early part of journey. And usually, laws tend to lag technology, and then the implementation tends to lag laws. So technology has gone far ahead. Then the laws are coming in. Okay, there's GDPR, but for rest of the world, it's still in progress. And then for companies, they are still in implementation phase. So yes, it's a journey, and we are not there yet. I would share that view. And in that context, if we see in the US, we have had the CCPA, and now recently we've also had the state of Virginia passing their own privacy law. So what's happening there? Are we in for a law per state, or will there be a federal law? And I ask this because I have also been part of one of the discussions with federal committee which came to Brussels, and they asked, is it good to have a federal law or not? But that was 2.5 years ago. So what are you seeing sitting in the US?
So there's no way we're going to have 50 state laws on privacy. And I'll tell you why. Because business corporations aren't going to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
We're not going to have 7 state privacy laws, I would say. Business and corporations lobbying efforts will just prevent that from ever happening. I don't think that they can necessarily prevent states from passing those laws, but they'll put pressure on the federal government to pass a federal law before that happens. But here's what I think is more likely to happen first. I think we're going to have a U.S. federal data breach law first. And I think that may come as soon as this year. Because it's really crazy to have 50 state laws. That was one of the things that I first sort of giggled about when I was, working for CSR, the privacy company that I was working. Why do we have 50, state laws? It's pretty crazy. It's incredibly hard for any business that has a data breach to try to figure out what the heck they're supposed to do once that data breach happens. It's magnificently crazy.
Yeah, but that's the challenge from a company perspective remains, I believe, similar, because even if US would have a federal law, then there's GDPR, then there's Brazilian law, then there's Australian, Canadian, Indian, Chinese, and everybody's having a law. And the beauty of it is most of them tend to anchor around GDPR, but just to nuance so that nobody can say they've copied from GDPR, they add a few things or change the word here and there. And that's the funny part, because then you're making it difficult for the companies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they
So,
want to be independent, but that just actually makes it more complicated.
right. I would have rather preferred, like, I think in 1980s, they came up with OECD guidelines for data protection, the principles.
Mhm.
And if they
Yeah.
would have extended that, at least a majority of big countries would have agreed on a common set of principles and then adopted it into a regulation or a law. But there has been a fair amount of gap between what they passed in as principles and what they are doing in the laws. It's completely my law, and my different thing. That's where it is. But you've been in content marketing, and you've been in marketing, and we recently, or in these days, we are hearing about Apple and Google introducing privacy related changes. There's the ATT, and then there's the resistance from Facebook, or so called uh, advocation on behalf of the small businesses. How do you see all this in context? Because now you can take a perspective from marketing side as well as from the privacy side. So how do you see this situation?
Well, I think the first point to make is that if Facebook wants to try to battle Google and Apple, at least as far as the mobile platform, they lose because they don't own the platform, right?
Yeah.
Uh, there's no way they can win that war. Uh, so, they can lobby in the newspapers all they want, but they can't win there. Um, the advertisers still, though, they want. Advertisers want first party data, right? They
Right.
have first party data, and they want a way to track external IDs. So it's not like Facebook is going to lose everything. Right?
No.
They're still going to have a part to play. And companies like the Trade Desk and LiveRamp, right? They're not going to disappear just because Apple and Google are making this change. There's still a large role to play for that ecosystem. It's just going to be different than it was under the cookie world and under the third-party data regime, right? So what's really happening is we're going from a world where everybody was sharing data back and forth with third-party data sort of ruling, where everyone was sharing data between vendors, right? To now a world where we have to try to figure out how to just use primarily first-party data. Now, obviously, vendors and companies try to get around that, right? But ultimately, they're going to have to figure out how to live with first-party data. There are some ways to live with first-party data, but still be able to get the benefits of third-party data.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Google is trying to do with Flock, right? It allows you to use federated learning to get the benefits of third-party data, but not actually have to share that third-party data with the person who's getting it, right? There's no sharing of the data, only the insights. So the data never actually leaves Google, only the insights. And there are other companies that are developing that kind of technology as well. There's a startup called InfoSum that's doing that, but big players like IBM are doing it as well. And I expect that same kind of technology is going to flow into organizations like the Trade Desk and LiveRamp, right? And so you'll end up with companies that are building profiles, right, on data brokers that have profiles on companies, on consumers, using that same kind of technology to share our data with first-party advertisers. with advertisers who have first-party data on us. So they'll get the same benefit of what they've been doing, but without having to move our data physically around and risk exposure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So it's an evolution that's going on, and there's much more behind it. And it's what we hear in the media is more the noise around it.
Right. So it doesn't really solve all of the privacy problems, right? We still have a large number of huge corporations that have deep profiles on us, which is a scary proposition.
Yeah.
But at least it's not 20,000 companies with extensive profiles on us and all this data leaking all over the place where bad actors can grab it as well as huge corporations.
Yeah.
Some people might argue that huge corporations are bad actors too, but at least it's not outright criminals.
Yeah. I think nobody has a problem sharing data. The problem is more around sharing it more transparently and letting it be with the right actors, not with the bad actors. And
right.
That is where all this evolution is, that where all this focus is in terms of privacy laws as well. So when we talk about privacy, we all know that it's challenging to be compliant 100% because business keeps changing. But what does compliance in privacy mean? Or if I may call, what does fitness in privacy mean? Like when we talk about health, we talk about fitness. We say health, you have it or not. But fitness, you go to gym, you go do action, do activity, and then you are fit or not. So what is compliance or fitness in privacy? And with so many laws and so much complexity around.
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't realize that fit for privacy, that's how you meant the fit to be. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's what I mean, because I had a privilege to work with somebody. I mean, that's a story maybe, but I had a CIO and he used to use this acronym. We have an IT and we have a choice to be healthy or we have a choice to be fit. So healthy means all our systems are running and acronym or the craze with word fitness. And that's when I also in my personal life developed fitness, because I was healthy and I wanted to remain healthy, but I started to choose focus on being healthy to being fit. And that's when the fit for privacy comes in, meaning you don't implement privacy from the standpoint of compliance management risk approach, but a cultural aspect and being fit, being ready for the nuances around privacy.
That's really wonderful. I like that a lot.
Thank you.
Well, so the way I like to think about it is, I think that there are probably 4 different ways you can think about sort of complying with privacy.
Mm-hmm.
You can be compliant with the letter of the law, and good luck with that. You're gonna have a tough time, right?
Yeah.
You can be compliant with the gist of the law, which is, I think, what probably most people try to do.
Yeah.
You can take a risk mitigation approach,
Yeah.
which is maybe what some companies try to do. I don't know that I necessarily recommend that approach, but I think some companies say, maybe I won't get caught, if I think this is a valuable enough, endeavor. And then there's a really interesting approach that I came across in another podcast that was on Caveat. I don't know, maybe a few months ago. Ohio State University has a risk institute, and I think the guy's name was Dennis Hirsch.
Mm-hmm.
He had an interesting presentation on ethics and data ethics, and essentially talking about how companies should really sort of approach privacy from an ethical issue. sort of just thinking about, what are we really willing to do, and can we think about privacy as what we should do as opposed to what these legislators are telling us we should do.
Right.
And I really think that may be the approach that companies ought to take. If you have a touchstone in your company of what you should be doing, that's probably a better way than letting legislators tell you what you should do.
Indeed. I think that's the right approach. The more advanced, more nuanced companies are looking like that. I had the great privilege to work in one such company. So we had the option as a privacy team to advise if it's fitting with privacy law or not. But there was an ethics committee which would decide if the initiative would go ahead or not. And they would not just decide based on the privacy input or the legal input. They would decide in function of, is it good for us as an organization? Does it stand for who we are? Does it match to what our values are? And that ethics committee was actually determining the direction and the initiatives rather than the privacy laws or other things. Of course, we had the power to say this is refer it to ethics side of it. So there was this dynamism, but the advanced or the companies which really care for reputation, they do care for privacy laws, but they care much more for their reputation and how they will be perceived in society.
Right. And I think that's just a beautiful approach. I mean, if you have an organization that can do that or that can afford to do that, it's a much better approach, right?
It is. And I also had, when I say fortune of that side, I had the fortune of working in the other side of also, wherein I was advocating transparency because GDPR, one of the principles is transparency. They were saying, let's implement it. And I said, okay, so you have an internal company policy, let's put it on the website. And then there was so much of hue and cry because transparency was not one of their values. The fear was it's a competitive differentiation. So they were justifying not putting the privacy policy on the website. I'm not talking the privacy statement. The personal data, why don't put it there? And all the argumentation was based around its competitive differentiation. How come you extract out of a legislation few pages and say this is our company privacy policy and that's competitive differentiation? But it's not that. Essentially behind it, it's the values and ethics and what you stand for.
Yeah.
It's an interesting debate, and it's I happen to be on both sides, and I've seen, and that gave me the insight or information saying if it doesn't match your values, you can't have too much around privacy principles or privacy strategy. Because typically privacy strategy people create from a law and say 7 principles, let's make it 6 or 8 or 9, and that's it. But it's not like that. You have to match and map your principles as business. So in essence of time, because time flies, and always in these conversations it does fly, I have to say, what is your one message to audiences who are listening to us in privacy, especially with your rich background that you have?
Wow. When listening to privacy podcasts, that's an interesting question. I think maybe just something a little bit trite, like don't judge a book by its cover. I listen to a whole lot of privacy podcasts, obviously, because I curate and moderate data privacy podcasts, right? I am continually amazed at the privacy podcasts I look at and say, this is not going to be any good. And then I start listening to it and wow, is it good? Because, oftentimes it doesn't sound like it's going to be interesting, or the description for the podcast is like, maybe it's just going to be another, maybe another boring interview, or I'm not sure that this person has much interesting to say. And then I am proven so wrong. There are so many interesting voices out there and so many people that have interesting backgrounds and interesting things to say, and such an amazing, community of privacy professionals. Maybe to some extent people need to write better descriptions of their podcasts, but I tell you what, it's just amazing the stuff that you can learn listening to these podcasts. I'm stunned on a daily basis.
Thank you so much. And now, after listening to this conversation, of course, people can decide whether they want to continue to listen to which podcast or which not. But the question is, if somebody wants to contact you and says, I want to ask Jeff a question, or we want to work with PrivacyPlan, how should they approach you? What's the best medium to connect with you?
Jeff at privacyplan.net, or visit me at my website, privacyplan.net. And I'm always available on LinkedIn.
Good. So LinkedIn, email, and the website. That's good.
Yep.
So thank you so much, Jeff, for being with us, sharing your thoughts, sharing your insights, and very useful, very insightful.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks for listening, and now we ask you for some help. Take a moment to subscribe and review this podcast. Your support matters. And if you have done it already, thank you so much. Now, if you have questions or suggestions, drop an email at hello@fit4privacy.com. And finally, if you know someone who will benefit from this, share this podcast with them and help us grow. Thank you so much. Stay safe and see you next time.